Good afternoon, Chairperson Pinto, members of the committee and staff. As you know, my name is Joanne Belton, and proudly I serve as the Executive Director for the DC Coalition Against Domestic Violence. DCCADV is the federally recognized statewide coalition of domestic violence service providers in the District of Columbia and includes 18 domestic violence member programs. As you have heard us share before, domestic violence is a critical issue in the district, with 39% of women and 25.5% of men living in DC having experienced sexual violence, physical violence, stalking, or a combination thereof perpetrated by an intimate partner. OVSJG is the main funder of domestic violence services in the district through its victim services line. In addition to this funding line, additional funding for domestic violence survivor services is allocated through access to justice, justice reentry grants, and even gun violence and truancy-related funding. DCCADV recognizes that domestic violence survivors receive and rely on services and resources provided through the OVSJG budget, judiciary and public safety broader portfolio, and most other government agencies and council committees. We appreciate OVSJG's partnership in the work of supporting survivors and their shared recognition that survivors need and deserve services to achieve safety and move forward on their healing journeys. We also thank you to Director Porter and her team for support and partnership of the field. As I shared in my testimony during the performance oversight hearing for OVSJG, in FY24, the agency added a new no-cause termination provision in their grant agreements with grantees. We join with our fellow OVSJG grantees in expressing the deepest concern over this new no-cause termination provision. Our organization and our members rely on the funding that we receive from OVSJG to provide critical life-saving services to survivors. It is not possible to plan annual budgets, hire and retain dedicated staff, and provide uninterrupted services to survivors, knowing that one of our main funders can pull funding mid-year with very little notice. We ask that the council remedy this in the Budget Support Act to have the clause removed or nullified so that we can focus on continuing to provide uninterrupted services to survivors. Additionally, we would like to add our voice to the seemingly annual issue of transparency that has been raised by our membership and the broader Victim Assistance Network that the mayor's budget does not comply with the transparency provisions of DC Code 4-571.01 again this year. This lack of clarity prevents service providers, council, and the community to inform and coordinate efforts to meet the needs of all victims and survivors. The impact of DV is experienced throughout the district. Children experiencing domestic violence in the home are more likely to be truant. People who have perpetrated domestic violence with a firearm are more likely to use those firearms in other contexts. Women in the U.S. and Black women specifically are more likely to be murdered during pregnancy or soon after childbirth than to die from the 3 leading obstetric causes of maternal mortality. My time is up. My colleague Micaela Deming will be covering the specific funding requests for victim and domestic violence survivor services. In closing, we stand in solidarity with the Victim Assistance Network and the Fair Budget Coalition, including their revenue raisers. Our district cannot balance budgets off the backs of our most vulnerable neighbors. I'm available for any questions. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Ms. Dalton. Micaela Deming, Policy Director of DC Coalition Against Domestic Violence.
Good afternoon, Chair Pinto, members of the committee and staff, and thank you for the accommodation this afternoon. We know that this is a tough budget year. Our goal is to maintain FY24 programming and service levels across the victim services sector. That would require the victim services line to be increased to $51.87 million. Unfortunately, we believe that the mayor's proposed budget erroneously included funding sources that have already been spent, leaving victim services funding cut, not increased, by about $3 million. I will note that there is a possibility that you will hear those funds are available. If these funds are indeed available as revenue for FY25 victim services grants, even though they have already been included in prior year budgets, that would necessarily mean that $6 million was not awarded in grants over the past 2 years in accordance with the approved DC budgets. Council must reverse the cuts, increase the victim services funding to maintain current service levels. Domestic violence survivor services save lives. They also reduce reliance on child welfare, law enforcement, criminal legal systems, medical care, public benefits, and many other government-funded agencies, which saves the district money. In further support of the need for funding for domestic violence survivor services, we have proposed adding a fee to marriage licenses and divorce complaints. Collecting these fees to specifically support domestic violence survivor services would add DC to the majority of states that partially fund these essential services with these fees. We anticipate that these fees generating revenue will not generate enough revenue to supplant existing funding, but can supplement existing victim services and the available funds in the victim services grants line. We ask the fees be directed to a non-lapsing fund to supplement the existing domestic violence survivor services and prevention efforts. Survivors in the district also depend on human services that have been cut in the mayor's budget, legal services, housing, food assistance, childcare, and many others. To have a budget that truly supports survivors, we need council to adequately fund access to justice, reentry grants, ERAP, PEF, SNAP, and other human services. I will note that reentry grants, as many as 94% of women who are incarcerated have a history of domestic violence, and that the domestic violence continues throughout their period of incarceration. The budget necessities we're advocating for still fall far short of the funding necessary to meet the needs of survivors. The true cost of survivor safety would require an additional $21.75 million to expand existing services and begin new programs for legal services, mental health services, housing units, culturally specific services, economic justice and cash assistance, language access, and prevention programming. We also stand in solidarity with the Victim Assistance Network and the Fair Budget Coalition, including their revenue raisers. Thank you for the time to testify this afternoon, and I welcome any questions.
And then when it comes to the funding available for OVSJG, initially the budget looked like it was a slight increase for DV. Not that it fulfilled all of the need, but we were thrilled that it was reflecting at least a recognition that these investments needed to be increased. But it's my understanding that it may be that some of those funds have already been spent. So can you elaborate a little bit more on how we know that and what that looks like and what that means for the actual proposed budget for DV victim services?
Yes, thank you for the question. So when we look into the budget tables over the last few years, we can see that each year the district gets Victims of Crime Act funding. We can see directly from the federal government exactly how much money comes through to the district. It's a formula award, so we know exactly how much it is. We can see that as we track back in budget years, we can see that each year included in the federal funding that is available is that year's amount of VOCA funding for OVSJG to spend. It's included there, and we know that that then creates the victim services line for the amount of dollars that are able to be granted out. We can see that for FY 23 and 24 and 25. The problem is when you look at FY 25's budget tables, it includes funds that were included in the FY 24 budget and the FY 23 budget. So necessarily those funds were either not spent in the prior years, even though they were included in the victim services grants line, or they were not spent and OVSJG underspent each year by about $3 million when victim services were asking for desperately needed additional funds. And so it's the VOCA years that appear to have been duplicated, and we have tried very hard to get additional clarity on that and have not gotten a satisfactory answer. But we do believe that those funds have already been fully spent or awarded out, and they are not available to the tune of around $6 million for the FY 25 budget. And that would lead to, instead of a $3.67 million increase, instead the line being a $2.7 million decrease.
From an operational perspective, if this budget were to move forward as proposed, what would the 2.7 million real reduction mean for the DV cluster of grantees?
And to be clear, it's not just domestic violence. There's sexual assault services that are funded with these dollars as well. The answer to that, I think, is challenging because of the other cuts in the access to justice funding line, because VOCA funds are supporting legal services also. The, just overwhelming cuts to that line of service, victim services across the OVSJG budget is so significant. I can't sparse out what that one little piece would look like.
Can I
Mhm.
add a little
Sure.
bit to that? I'm sure that you have heard and will continue to hear from a number of victim services providers today. We have seen over the last several years an increase in demand and request for domestic violence services that cannot be met even with the funding levels that we have had. And so to see a decrease to that level um, is necessarily going to mean that there are time periods where you can't access certain services like an attorney to file a protection order, to support someone through a custody or divorce case, to accompany them in as a victim through a criminal trial, which leads to folks being less safe. But it means less services to folks that are relying on them and that we as a community are relying on to keep people safe and alive.
I don't know if this is an error in the budget, um, or the way that I'm reading it, but it appears that some of the federal sources of money have already been spent in either fiscal year 23 or 24, but are reflected in the proposed fiscal year 2025 budget. So when I first looked at the budget, I thought that this was an increase in victim services of around 2%. But if that $3 million, maybe it's $2.7 million has already been spent, then it would actually be a reduction in the budget. And so am I reading this incorrectly or what's going on here?
So you are reading it correctly. It is a reduction. Um, In the process of putting the budget together, what we do is we'll go through and we'll identify the grants that we are going to, grant estimates that we are going to put together for the next fiscal year. Unfortunately, in this case, as it relates to those grants, they slipped through the cracks. We would have, the amounts that should have been there should have been less. And so basically what we do every year after the budget is approved is we do go through and we look at all the grants, try to make sure we reconcile them to what the correct carryover is. So when October 1st comes, we will make sure that all those grants or budgets are adjusted to whatever up or down the level they need to be. Unfortunately, in this case, we do show some excess grant funds that in reality have been already spent in this fiscal year and possibly in prior fiscal years, depending on what grants you're talking about.
Okay, so because one of our witnesses testified earlier that these funds were either already spent or it's a reflection of underspent funds that rolled over. So it's the former, that they were already spent?
As it relates to the larger amount, I think the answer is it was already spent. I'm not going to say that it's 100% that way because we do have, because these are multi-year grants, there is going to be carryover that carries into the next fiscal year. But in this case, as it relates to the VOCA grants, yes. In that case, that would be a situation that those grants, from what we've looked at for the most part, have already been spent.
Okay, and so in that case, what was the rationale for a reduction of these grants?
I think if we look at the numbers, victim services on the local side is basically the same as it was last year. It's the fact that we've got the additional grants that have inflated the overall budget for victim services that we will need to go through, review, and then adjust them according to what their correct carryover amounts are, or if they're new grants, what the new grant amount.
Okay, but I'm putting aside the federal grant error.
Okay,
You started off by saying you are reading it correctly. It is a reduction in the budget.
on the federal grant side. On the federal grant side,
What about on the local side?
we're strictly focusing on the federal grant side. That's the part where we see where the miscalculation of the estimated amounts for those grants are. I mean, it does impact the overall budget for victim services, but the part that needs to be, that we will be focusing on is the federal grant side of that.
Right, understood, but I'm asking from a policy choice perspective. What was the rationale for proposing a budget that reduced the victim services funding available, whether it was from federal or local. Why was that choice made?
Okay, so I'm looking at the program victim services. And based on the report that I'm looking at, we actually overall are showing an increase of about $3.6 million, which if you net out the federal portion that we need to adjust would still be an increase overall. Now, I also understand that we do have a decrease. We have a decrease as relates to $500,000 in SPR also. That would impact that. And that has to do with the fact that revenues continue to go down with the DC courts.
And my understanding is that as well is a quasi-federal payment, but for the local, for victim services, it's not a reduction. It's a bump.
Yeah, if you look at it, on page C-134, you'll see, program code PS0023. You'll see it went from 45,151 to 49,186. And that of course includes the federal grant piece that we need to adjust. But even if it's less than $3 million, and we have about $500,000 or $600,000 in SPR that we're reducing, you're still going to have an overall increase in the victim services budget.
And how much will the total increase be?
From what I can see, it's going to be I don't think it's going to be a lot. It's going to be just basically kind of flatlined.
Okay. So trying to reconcile what we heard earlier, that it would be a reduction.
I think they're focusing on what they see, which is that federal grant piece. That's the only thing I can think of
Okay.
because that sticks out.
Okay.
I'm going to be honest with you, it sticks out. And if we pull that back and we look at what the increase is, which is 3.6, and we let's just say that it's an even 3 million that we need to adjust the grants down for. And then you got about 600,000 for the SPR because of the revenue issues from the DC courts. We're basically showing a flatline budget for VS.
Okay.
That
And
makes
that was
sense?
yes, that is starting to make more sense. So was it your intention to keep the victim services budget stable?
I think the intention was to not just maintain what we have, but to also try in this fiscal climate to make sure that we're advocating and supporting increases in funding where we can. We see a bump of roughly a little under $1.5 million in the victim services line and on the grant line. And so again, our goal is to make sure that for the existing programs that we have, that we can sustain them. I think the past couple of years have been, can't even just say the past couple of years, but we know our community has went through the transition of our financial management system. We're transitioning now through a new grants management system. And while we're working to make sure that the infrastructure is there, we want to make sure that we're continuing to support these grantees as the agency, as the work continues and ultimately as it grows. So on the local side, there is an increase.
Okay. But because of the reality of the federal grant line item, combining federal and local, in practice, it will be stabilized from last year.
And also the SPR reduction too.
And the
You got to
SPR.
make sure you include that in there too.
Okay. So it will be a tiny increase technically, but negligible increase. So it'll be stable. Okay. Okay. That is very helpful information. Is the federal grant discrepancy going to be reflected in the mayor's errata letter?
It can be. I mean, that's one of the conversations that Director Porter and I will have as relates to any reflections that we would want to do from the federal side. So, I mean, we definitely would have these things corrected before before we start the fiscal year. If that's something, and we'll have that discussion offline and you'll find out. How about that?
And one of the things that I'll just add here is this is really why I think, it's important for us to work with our sister agencies and our advocacy networks, because this is not just predicting what the spend is for our grantees and the important work of our grant managers to make sure that our grantees are that, as OVSJG awards all of our federal awards, but we also are having to look to Congress to see what we're actually funding. So as we look at the trends in terms of those federal awards, not just what we're spending, what we know we've received and making the estimate, but it's also a little bit of, watching what's happening on the Hill in terms of what we're going to be awarded. It is tricky, and it's one of the reasons why I think you see 120 people show up and wanting to lend their voice, and one of the reasons that not shameless plug, but while we have to continue to fight for statehood in terms of those federal formula awards and how important and critical that advocacy is. And so, there are a couple of different lines that go into establishing our budget, but John and the OCFO's team can follow up with you about the discrepancies.
Okay, well, thank you. I guess as it relates to the errata letter, I would just say, I hope we can do a little better than I'll find out. I think it needs to be reflected on there, and should continue to be a priority. And as Director Porter, you were just saying, there are certain things that you think should be increased, and it seems like victim services is one of them, that you articulated as kind of wanting it to be an increase. Just this federal grant was misreflected, but there could be an opportunity to adjust that. So I'll put that there.
Well, if I could just clarify that, I think the administration wants to increase victim services as well, which is what the decision was made. I think also just to land the plane on it, the point is that those federal awards are estimates and projections and predictions. And so I think it is important that, when we're having the conversation, you and, and your council colleagues, that those awards are things that we work throughout the year to monitor. And even after the local budget process, we're still applying for and receiving information and updates around those federal awards and those amounts beyond what our estimates are. So there's a both and there.
Thank you. So last year during the budget process, the council designated most of the 10.5 million that it provided to restore the victim service line item to domestic violence. And it's estimated that last year OVSJG awarded $16.3 million to domestic violence survivor services and $7.9 million to domestic, sexual, and gender-based violence services, which includes the emergency and transitional housing for victims. But it looks like OVSJG awarded about $1 million less to domestic violence and the domestic, sexual, gender-based violence than the prior year. And so I'm concerned that the council's designation of that priority that we were just discussing was not followed or didn't influence the award decisions of OVSJG or was otherwise cut. So what happened with that?
Let me follow up with you on that. I think you may, what I may understand, what I'm going to try to interpret, but I'll follow up to confirm on some of the federal enhancements. So those ARPA enhancements that we can specifically earmark because they are one time. We try to make sure that we're earmarking them for like capital projects and, again, those projects that the council prioritizes. But let me follow up with my team on the DV.
Okay.
Let me follow up on
That would be helpful because I do hear you in, our previous discussion, you're talking about the budgets with the council and this is the council's choice and if we want to designate things. And then we did, but it may not have been followed. And so I don't know kind of how to reconcile those two things. So that would be helpful, to get a better sense of that.
Happy to, and I think also just to make sure that we qualify the process again, OVSJG is making those awards for the full budget, and then the grantees have to spend so that time that the team works to make sure that those funds get out the door. It may be there. I'm just gonna have the team to follow up.
Okay. Thank you very much. So the Victim Services Network has calculated and determined that the minimum baseline that they need to maintain their services is almost $52 million, which includes a 19% increase for unfunded services in 2024 and a 3.5% increase for cost of living adjustments and current inflation trends. So I guess what is your response to the need of maintenance of service currently for victim services versus how you're thinking about this proposed budget to get us there?
I appreciate the victims, the VAN, the Victims Advocacy Network, for their work to coalesce and build a consensus on the need. The reality is that the agency considers the awards based on the applications that come in. In terms of sustaining, we're in a position this year across the administration where, funds are challenged. And so, our commitment in terms of prioritizing those existing programs that we fund and making sure that we can not just fund programs, but again, through programs like our capacity building program and our partnership and technical assistance and grant management, is to support grantees in their successful execution of the awards. We do have many grantees where the Office of Victim Services is, one of the sole sources of funding. And unfortunately, in this fiscal climate, what revenue reductions mean is that those programs that we sustain unfortunately see that impact and they see those cuts. And so we'll continue to work with our grantees to, help to support them, push the funds that they have to the community. And, through programs like our capacity building program, helping them to be more competitive for OVSJG funds and funds across the government.